Hello, Chess Club. Welcome to the next installment of our lessons on tactics. Today we're going to talk about a tactic called the skewer. Now, as you recall, the very first time we came together in Chess Club, we talked about the importance of straight lines in chess. We looked at the board and we talked about the straight lines of squares going up, that was called a file, the straight lines going across, that was called a rank, and the straight line that goes at an angle, that's called a diagonal. And we talked about the power of some of the most important pieces that also move in a straight line. The rooks move along ranks and files in a straight line. Those are your long distance pieces. The queens can move along ranks and files and the diagonals. And the bishops can also move along diagonals, always in a straight line. The knight is the only piece that turns a corner. Many of these tactics are based on the power of these long-range pieces on straight lines, and so you need to learn to look for and recognize when certain pieces are lined up along a straight line. We talked about this first when we talked about discover check. Notice that the rook is lined up with the king. The rook along the d file is pointed through the bishop at the king. So when the bishop moves along this straight line diagonal, it uncovers this check. And to find that discovered check, you need to be looking for the pieces that are lined up on this straight line. When the bishop moves along the diagonal here to attack the rook, so you're attacking two pieces, the king here and the rook here, notice that along this diagonal is another tactic that we talked about last time called the pin. This rook absolutely cannot move because the bishop is attacking the rook, but also lined up with the king. So if the rook moves, the king would be in check, and we discussed last time that's against the rules of chess. This is the tactic called a pin. Now, the tactic that we're going to discuss today, the skewer, is also based on a straight line. So if I hold up this stick, hopefully you can all see it, this is a skewer. Notice, like a pin, it is a straight line, and you use a skewer to poke through things. It's got a pointed side. So if I take, for example, a banana, the skewer can go through one banana. It can skewer another banana. It can skewer another banana. Do you notice how the skewer goes right through these pieces of banana? And that's the principle of a skewer in chess. That here, what we have is a pin. This rook absolutely cannot move. But if we were to move the rook to the place where the king was and the king to the place that the rook was, like this, now we still have pieces lined up on the diagonal in a straight line along this line, but the king is now in check, so the king must move, okay? Before, we had a pin and the rook could not move. Now we have the reverse and the king must move. And when I say the reverse, that's why skewers are sometimes called reverse pins, okay? So the king must move, and then the bishop can capture the rook, okay? Okay, here's the next position. This position may be familiar to some of you because this happens very often in an end game. Black has a king and a queen. White has a king and a rook. So black is ahead. Black has a 9-point queen to white's 5-point rook. Black's best option here is to try to get the rook off the board. White wants to get the queen off the board because then they can win. A king and a queen against a king can win. A king and a rook against just a king can also win. Now here's where you look for the things that I was telling you, which is you look to see how the pieces line up along straight lines. Some players may first look for check. So for example, the rook could come up here and check the king, and check is fine, except in this position, the queen would take the rook, boom, and now black will win this game. So let's backtrack for a minute. Looking for check is good. That is one check. But remember, the rook can move in a straight line not just along files, but also along ranks. And here, if the rook gives check on d1, then we have the perfect lineup. We have a skewer. The rook looks through the king to the queen. In fact, sometimes people call the skewer not just a reverse pin, it's also referred to as an X-ray, because the rook is looking right through the king to the queen, just like an X-ray looks right through a person's skin to the bones. Now, the king is in check, the king must move, and the rook gets the queen, and now white will win. Because as you know, and I hope you've all practiced, anytime you have a king and rook against a king, you can force a checkmate. Please practice that at home so that we can practice it on a Zoom lesson and you can see if you can checkmate me. Okay, here is the final position that I want to show you in this particular lesson. Remember, in the last position we were talking about endgame winning chances. So let's look at the position here. White has a king and a bishop against black's king, knight, and pawn. Now, white cannot win. You cannot force a checkmate with a king and a bishop. So white is playing for a draw. What they need to do is take away black's winning chances, which have to do with this pawn. Because if black can promote that pawn, they can get a queen, and then they can win. So skewers at the end game can also be a way of helping you get something as small as a pawn off the board, because sometimes pawns are important. And again, you have to look really for lining up pieces along those long, straight lines, and in the bishop's case, the diagonal. So for example, if the bishop moves here to attack the pawn would just take the bishop. The bishop's on the dark squares, the bishop cannot check the king. So what you look for is things like this. Along this dark diagonal, the knight and the pawn are lined up. So just push the bishop to this diagonal, attacking the knight, but actually looking through the knight to the pawn, skewering, so that the knight must move, and then the bishop takes the pawn, and this is a draw. This is a tie game, which is the best white could do here. White gets half a point with their king and their bishop, and black gets half a point with their king and their knight. I will be emailing you some puzzles for you to do at home and practice the skewer, and then in the next lesson next week, we will talk about how to use a skewer in a full game of chess. Looking forward to seeing you then.